Today's topic is the truth about the Founding Fathers and separation of church and state. After our speakers have their say, we'll have some question and answer time. You may write your questions down on the index cards provided, and I'll collect them later, in case there's any duplicate. I'll go through looking for duplicate questions and things like that, and then we'll take the questions one at a time. Rob Boston of Americans United, who with us here is here today. Here he is. Rob is the Senior Policy Analyst and Assistant Director of Communications for Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and serves as the Assistant Editor of AU's monthly magazine, Church and State. He joined the Americans United staff in 1987. He's the author of 3 books: Close Encounters with the Religious Right, Journeys into the Twilight Zone of Religion and Politics by Prometheus Books, 2000. The Most Dangerous Man in America, Pat Robertson and the Rise of the Christian Coalition, Prometheus Books, 1996. And Why the Religious Right is Wrong About the Separation of Church and State, Prometheus Books, 1993, and a second edition of that was printed in 2003. And he also serves as a spokesman for Americans United and has appeared on MSNBC's Countdown with Keith Olbermann, CNN's Anderson Cooper, Fox News Channel's O'Reilly Factor, and other programs. But before we bring you Rob Boston, we also present our local friend, Fred Whitehead, who is a Kansas native, and in his younger days worked on farms in the Rock Island Railroad. After graduating from the University of Kansas in 1965, he studied England on a Fulbright scholarship and earned a Master's of Arts and PhD degrees from Columbia University. His doctoral dissertation was on the epic poems of William Blake. After teaching 4 years in Illinois, he returned to Kansas where he became an industrial worker, and then the assistant director of the preceptorship program at the University of Kansas School of Medicine for 22 years. Among his scholarly publications are Free Thought on the American Frontier, Prometheus Books, 1992, editions of notable American poets Don Gordon and Vincent Perini, University of Illinois Press, and contributions to reference works such as the New Encyclopedia of Unbelief. Fred's current research projects include Free Thinkers in the Union Army, Free Thought in the American South, and Free Thinking Physicians. And now for our panel discussion. First up is Fred Whitehead.
Could I ask Rob to start, because I'm...
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Because he's going to sort of lay out the basic facts, and I'm going to talk about a difference.
All right. Well, then first up is Rob Boston.
Great. I want to make sure I can be heard. Can everybody hear me? Great, good. I'm not a lawyer. I just sometimes play one on TV. And because I've watched enough lawyer shows, I guess I can kind of fake it. And what I want to do with my presentation today is sort of lay the case out and present the evidence in a way that if we were in a courtroom, an attorney might in fact do. So I'm going to go through a couple of different points, and we're looking at this question of what did the founders believe about separation of church and state, what was their intention, were we founded to be a quote-unquote Christian nation? If not, what was the intention? And I want to start with, I think when you're looking at this question, you really need to start with the text of the Constitution itself. This is where a lot of people, I think, go astray when we're looking at this question. The Constitution is the foundational government document of the country. It establishes the type of government we have, the 3 branches, how they will interact, and it's really the document we need to be looking at when we're talking about this question. And the reason I point that out is that you sometimes will hear individuals on the religious right referring to other documents, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, to make their case that the country was founded to be a Christian nation. And these other documents, while interesting historically, aren't really relevant. The document that is relevant is the U.S. Constitution. What does it say? Does it say we were meant to be a Christian nation? Well, there was a poll out a couple of months ago, one of those kind of polls that you read and then you want to go hide under the bed for the rest of the day, because it surveyed people and their knowledge of what the Constitution says. And some remarkably high number of people do in fact believe that the Constitution states that the United States is officially a Christian nation. And of course it says no such thing. As a matter of fact, the Constitution in its First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those are the religion clauses of the First Amendment. Furthermore, Article 6 of the Constitution states that there shall be no religious test for federal office. And that's really all the Constitution says about religion. There's certainly no proclamation of Christianity being extolled or held up over other religions. Now, this was discussed at the time of the framing and the writing of the Constitution. There was discussion about this. By the way, this is a copy of my book, Why the Religious Right is Wrong, about separation of church and state. That book and this book, The Godless Constitution by Kramnik and Moore, are ones I would recommend that you take a look at if you want more information about this topic. There was a gentleman who was a delegate from the state of Maryland. His name was Luther Martin. And he noted, with some sarcasm, that the Constitutional Convention delegates had discussed the question of religious references in the Constitution. There were some members, he later wrote, so unfashionable as to think that a belief in the existence of a deity and of a state of future rewards and punishments would be some security for the good conduct of our rulers, and that, in a Christian country, it would be at least decent to hold out some distinction between the professors of Christianity and of downright infidelity or paganism. Now, Martin is speaking sarcastically here because he favored the view that there should be some religious reference in the Constitution. But his statement is a good indication that this was discussed, that it was debated, and that the side he favored did not carry the day. And that is why we have a Constitution that is secular. Another piece of evidence is the reaction to the Constitution after it was released to the general public. There were ministers who were very unhappy about that. In 1793, a minister named John Mason of New York said that the lack of references to God and Christianity in the Constitution were, quote, an omission which no pretext whatever can palliate. He predicted that divine retribution would rain down on the country and that God's vengeance would, quote, overturn from its foundations the fabric we have been rearing and crush us to atoms in the wreck. Sort of sounds like a Pat Robertson of the era. So you had these pastors who were not happy with the Constitution, not happy with the language in it because it was secular. And that was, I think, that is strong evidence that the document was not meant to be Christian, because if it had been, you would have found these pastors supporting it much more aggressively and being happy about it. You also had, at this time, a number of pastors who were working very strongly and affirmatively for the separation of church and state. And it's interesting that these folks have tended to be overlooked. I want to tell you a little bit for a few minutes about one of them named John Leland. John Leland was a Baptist minister. He lived in Massachusetts. He lived for a while in Virginia, and then went back to Massachusetts. He was a close friend of Thomas Jefferson. And now John Leland, as a Baptist, obviously was a very religious man. In fact, he theologically was quite conservative. But he was friends with Jefferson, who was sort of a proponent of more unorthodox views. And they worked together to end state support for religion in Virginia. John Leland has an interesting distinction in American history. He helped personally end state-endorsed religion in 3 states: Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. And he didn't even live in Connecticut. He just kind of went over there from Massachusetts and stirred things up. So you have this guy who's very strong, very powerful, who would speak out against the idea that there should be any kind of combination between church and state. Let me read you one of his famous quotes. Government has no more to do with the religious opinions of men than it has to do with the principles of mathematics. Let every man speak freely without fear. Maintain the principles that he believes. Worship according to his own faith, either one God, 3 gods, no God, or 20 gods. Let government protect him in doing so. See that he meets with no personal abuse or loss of property for his religious opinions. If his doctrine is false, it will be confuted. If it's true, let others credit it. Interesting passage there. 1 God, 3 gods, no God, or 20 gods. Because that language echoes a famous statement that Thomas Jefferson made later in some of his writings about individuals being fit for public office where they worship 1 God, 20 gods, or no gods. The two were clearly influencing one another. Now, the reason I point to people like Leland is to make the case that there were many ministers at the time of the founding who were very strongly in favor of the separation between church and state.